Walk into any church you have ever visited. Stand in the nave for a moment. Look around, count what you see, start with the windows. The apostles are there, most of them. Peter holding his keys. John with the eagle, James, Matthew, Thomas. 12 names, 12 faces, 12 stories carved into the glass or cast in stone or painted on the walls. Now look at the side chapels. Read the names on the memorial windows, the donation plaques, the feast day calendars. Notice which months are full. Notice which names appear on the altars. Now ask yourself a question. Ask it quietly, to yourself. Of every person whose name is carved into that building, whose image fills those windows, whose feast day appears in the calendar, whose statue stands in the niches along the walls, how many of them paid for the ministry itself? How many of them covered the food, the lodging, the travel between Galilean towns? How many of them bankrolled the movement that eventually built the building you are standing in? I do not mean theologically, I mean materially. Who paid the bills? Take your time. Try to name them. My name is Nathan. 12 years teaching history at a Catholic school in Evansville, Indiana. I resigned when I started finding evidence the institution preferred I not find. This channel is what I do now. I want to tell you exactly how this started for me, because it started with a Greek word. Specifically, it started in a New Testament Greek course I audited at a seminary about 15 years before I resigned from teaching. The professor was working through Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. He paused at the Greek word diakonein. He translated it. Providing material support, he said. Wrote it on the board. Moved on. A few weeks later, same professor, same course. We were in Romans chapter 16, Phoebe. He paused at the same Greek root, diakonos. This time, deaconess, a church title, an institutional office. I opened my notes from the Luke session. I wrote the Greek root in the margin of my Romans workbook. I drew a line between the two uses. I raised my hand. Same root, I said. Different translation. Why? The professor looked at me for a moment. Then he said, context determines translation. That night I went home and did something I should have done years earlier. I took a blank piece of paper and made 2 columns. Every occurrence of diakonein, diakonos, diakonia in the New Testament. Left column, cases where scholars translate it as service, support, helping out. Right column, cases where it becomes a title, an office, a formal institutional role. I worked until past 2 in the morning. The results were unambiguous. Left column, women. Right column, men. Same verb. 2,000 years of translation history. 2 entirely different outcomes depending on who was performing the act. I set the paper on my desk, picked it up, set it down again. And then I went to find out who the women in Luke 8 actually were. Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. 3 sentences. That is the entirety of what the canonical Bible tells you about the women who funded the ministry of Jesus. Let me read them to you exactly as they appear. After this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna, and many others. These women were ministering to them out of their own means. 3 sentences, 3 named women, an unnamed group of others, and the Greek word for what they did, Diakonein, the same word that gets translated as deacon, as minister, as formal religious office, when applied to men. In the NIV, were ministering. In the King James, ministered unto him of their substance. In the ESV, provided for them out of their means. None of these translations use the word deacon, none of them use minister in the institutional sense. They use helping, serving, providing, supporting. The women whose private wealth kept the movement alive were given the domestic translation of a word the institution reserved for a formal office when men held it. Now let me tell you who these women were. Mary Magdalene you have heard of. Susanna you have not. She is named once. This one time. She is never mentioned again in any canonical gospel, any church list, any calendar of saints in the first 8 centuries of Christian history. She had enough private wealth to fund an itinerant religious movement. She gets 3 syllables in the Christian canon. 3 syllables, and then silence. Then there is Joanna. Joanna is the most explosive figure in this passage, and she is almost certainly the least known. Luke is precise about who she is. Wife of Chuza. Chuza was Herod Antipas's epitropos. That word matters. The Greek epitropos means estate manager, household steward, superintendent of court finances. Chuza ran Herod's estates, controlled his court finances, managed his household administration. He was the chief financial officer of the man who ruled Galilee, and his wife was funding the movement her husband's employer was trying to suppress. Herod Antipas had already executed John the Baptist. Luke, chapter 13, verse 31, records Pharisees warning Jesus directly that Herod wants to kill him too. Herod was watching the movement. The man who controlled Herod's household finances was, by extension, inside Herod's intelligence network. He knew which way the political wind was blowing. He had to know. His job depended on it. And his wife was spending her own private means to fund the man her husband's employer was surveilling. John P. Meier of Catholic University of America, in the 3rd volume of A Marginal Jew published through Doubleday, called the Luke 8, 1-3 tradition historically reliable. His reasoning was specific and textual. There is no theological motivation that would lead Luke to invent a detail as granular as Chuza's administrative title. Nobody forging a religious document manufactures the name of a middle bureaucrat in a regional royal court. You invent miracles. You invent theology. You do not invent the name of Herod's household manager. The specificity argues for a real source. Someone in the early community actually knew who Joanna was, knew her by name, knew her husband's role, knew that she had spent her own money to keep Jesus fed and housed and moving through Galilee. And Luke, writing for a Gentile audience decades later, chose to include that detail. In 3 sentences, you have heard the word disciples thousands of times, maybe tens of thousands, in churches, in readings, in homilies, in the illustrated children's Bible with the pictures of 12 men walking along a road in golden light. You have heard about their names, their failures, their arguments about who would be greatest in the kingdom. You have heard Peter's denials and Thomas's doubt and James and John angling for the best seats at the table. You have a detailed relationship with the 12. You know their stories, you know their failures, you know what they got wrong. Now answer me this. Who housed them in Capernaum? Who covered the lodging when they traveled between towns? Who organized the food for 30 or 40 people moving through rural Galilee? Who arranged the Passover meal in Jerusalem? Who knew which doors to knock on when they arrived in a new city? Who paid for it? The answer is in your Bible. It has always been in your Bible. 3 sentences, Luke 8, 1-3. You sat in Sunday school. You sat through Christmas services. You sat through decades of sermons about the disciples and their journeys and their faith and their failures. And no one told you there was a treasurer. No one told you there was a logistics coordinator. No one told you there was a woman with court connections who used her own private wealth to fund everything those 12 men did. Not because it was not in the text. It was always in the text. 3 sentences. Luke 8, 1-3. It was always there. Let me go back to the word. Because the word is not a secondary detail, the word is the whole argument. Elisabeth Schüssler Fiorenza is a professor of divinity at Harvard. Her 1983 book, In Memory of Her, published by Crossroad, is one of the foundational texts of New Testament scholarship. It is not a fringe work. It is taught in mainstream seminaries across the theological spectrum. Schüssler Fiorenza did exactly what I did at my kitchen table, except with decades of specialization and the resources of a Harvard faculty position. She documented every occurrence of the Diakonein word group in the New Testament. Her conclusion was precise. The same Greek root is systematically translated differently, depending on whether the person performing the action is male or female. When men perform Diakonein, it becomes deacon, minister, servant of the church in the formal institutional sense. When women perform Diakonein, it becomes help, support, provide for, take care of. This is not a lexical necessity. The word does not require this distinction. The word is neutral. The distinction was introduced by the translators, by interpreters who already had a mental category for male ministry and a different mental category for female service, and who reached without thinking for the domestic word when the subject was female. Schüssler Fiorenza calls this a systematic translation pattern, not an isolated mistake, not an oversight, a pattern reproduced across centuries, across translation teams, across theological traditions that disagreed on nearly everything else. They all made the same choice when they hit that word, and the subject was a woman. Now look at what was lost in the choice. The Greek text of Luke 8 verse 3 says, "These women were performing Diakonein for the entire ministry, for Jesus and the 12, out of their own private resources." The same verb that built the institutional office of deacon. The same verb Paul uses when he calls Phoebe a diakonos of the church at Centrae, applied to women who were doing the thing the institution later formalized as a sacred office. Before the office existed, before the institution existed, they were the first people to do it. And they got a footnote. But the translation problem is not the deepest layer. The deepest layer is a name, specifically the disappearance of a name, and its replacement with a different name that never existed. In Romans chapter 16 verse 7, Paul writes this, "Greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was." Outstanding among the apostles. Paul is writing that. The same Paul who built the theological foundation of Christianity, who was, by his own account in Galatians, more zealous for the tradition than anyone around him. He is calling Junia outstanding among the apostles. Junia is a woman's name. It was common throughout the Roman world. The name appears in inscriptions, letters, census records across the empire. No scholar of antiquity has ever found a single ancient document using the masculine form Junias. Not one inscription, not one letter, not one tax record or funerary marker. The masculine Junias does not appear in any ancient source before the 13th century. In the 13th century, a commentator named Aegidius of Rome read the passage and decided the apostle must be male. He invented a masculine form. It had no historical basis. It appeared in no ancient document, and it was carried forward by commentator after commentator, century after century, until the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament, the standard critical edition used by scholars and translators worldwide, still printed Junius in the 20th century. A masculine name with no ancient attestation, invented in the medieval period, reproduced in the standard Bible text for 700 years. It took until 1994 for the standard Greek New Testament to restore Junia, a woman, an apostle, named by Paul himself as outstanding. Erased for 700 years by a masculine form that was invented in the 13th century and exists in no ancient source. Now, Richard Bolcom is Professor Emeritus of New Testament Studies at the University of St. Andrews. His 2002 book Gospel Women, published by W.M.B. Eerdmans, contains a sustained examination of one specific argument. His thesis is this: Joanna, the woman in Luke 8, 1-3, the wife of Chuza, is the same person Paul calls Junia in Romans 16. Joanna was her Hebrew name. Junia was her Roman name, the one she would have used in the Western missionary context Paul was writing from. The same person. Two names, two audiences. The woman who appears at the empty tomb in Luke chapter 24 verse 10, where Luke names her explicitly among the first witnesses to the resurrection, went on to become the woman Paul calls outstanding among the apostles. The financial backer became the first witness. The first witness became an apostle. The apostle's name was changed to male in the 13th century, and nobody corrected it for 700 years. Here is the thing that gets lost in every discussion of Luke 8, 1-3. The passage does not end with Joanna and Susanna. It ends with something that should stop you. And many others, women, plural, who provided for them out of their own private means. The movement of 12 male apostles, the movement that the church built its entire institutional history around, that it named and commemorated and celebrated for 2,000 years, was financially underwritten by an unnamed cohort of women whose number Luke never specifies. We do not know if it was 5 or 50. We know they existed. We know they had independent wealth. We know they chose to deploy that wealth in service of a movement that the Roman governor was watching and the regional king was surveilling. Meier's assessment of the historical reliability of this passage is worth sitting with. Luke did not invent Chuza's name. Luke did not invent Joanna's court connection. These details carry the texture of actual memory, of someone who knew this woman, knew her husband's administrative title, knew the specifics. The information was preserved because someone in the early church actually knew her, and Luke, writing his gospel, chose to include it. In 3 sentences: no feast days, no stained glass, no calendar commemorations in the first 8 centuries. Susanna got 3 syllables. The many others got no syllables at all. The movement they funded built the institution that forgot their names. There is something I want to say to you directly. If you have sat in churches for years and felt, without being able to name it, that the women in the story were more central than the telling made room for, you were right. Not about a calculated conspiracy, not about a room of bishops deciding to bury evidence, about something quieter than that, something more systematic than that, something that works through accumulated omission rather than active suppression. The historical record agrees with the intuition you could never quite put into words. Luke 8, 1-3 is in every Bible that has ever been printed. The word Diakonein is in the Greek text. Joanna's husband's title is in the Greek text. Schüssler Fiorenza's documentation of the translation pattern was published in 1983. Barkham's argument about Joanna and Junior was published in 2002. The restoration of Junior's name in the standard Greek New Testament happened in 1994. None of this is hidden. None of it is classified. None of it was burned. It lived in the scholarship, in the lexicons, in the critical editions, in the academic journals. It was always accessible to anyone willing to look. What the institution never did. In 2,000 years of sermons, of Christmas homilies, of catechism classes, of Sunday school rooms, was bring it from the scholarship to the pew. The record was always there. It was the editing that disagreed. J.J. Benítez spent 40 years researching what happened in the final year of Jesus' ministry. In Caballo de Troya, the Jerusalem volume, Benítez returns repeatedly to a figure that has always struck me as the most under-examined person in the entire narrative: Joanna. Benítez portrays her as the logistical intelligence of the Jerusalem operation, not a footnote, not a supporting character, the person who knew how the city worked, who knew which doors to knock on, who knew where to find a room large enough for the Passover meal and discreet enough to protect the group from surveillance. She was Herod's treasurer's wife. She had moved in the administrative circles of Jerusalem. She knew the city's inner workings in a way that no fisherman from Capernaum could know it. Benítez describes her managing the arrangements, coordinating the safe house network, navigating the streets of Jerusalem with the kind of social access that a woman of her class and connections could have, and that a Galilean craftsman simply could not. I want to be honest about where Benítez ends and the canonical record begins. Benítez is reconstructing. He is working from his own sources and his own imagination, filling in the gaps. But what the canonical text confirms is already remarkable on its own terms. Joanna was there from the beginning of the Galilean ministry. She was there at the crucifixion. She was there at the tomb. Luke 24 verse 10 names her explicitly. She was among the first people to carry news of the resurrection to the 11 apostles. The woman who funded the movement was the first witness to the event the movement was built on. That is not a supporting detail. That is the center of the story. And in most tellings of that story, she is a footnote in someone else's chapter. Here is the fact all 4 Gospels agree on. At the crucifixion, the 12 were gone. Matthew 27, verses 55 and 56. The women were there. Mark 15, verses 40 and 41. The women were there, watching from a distance, following him from Galilee, and ministering to him. Diakonein, the same word. And among them the text is specific. Luke 23, verse 49. Those who knew him stood at a distance watching, and the women who had followed him from Galilee. John 19 verse 25. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. 4 Gospels, 4 different accounts, 1 consistent record. The funders stayed. Not the named apostles whose faces fill the windows. The women, the ones who had been there since Galilee, the ones who had covered the food, the lodging, the travel. They were there at the death. And then before dawn on the first day of the week, some of them went back to the tomb. Luke 24 verse 10. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. The men did not believe them. Luke says so directly. The 11 dismissed the testimony of the women who had financed their entire ministry, witnessed their teacher's death, and walked to his tomb at first light. The church built its entire theology on the resurrection, the foundational event of 2,000 years of Christian doctrine. The event Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the cornerstone of everything, without which faith is futile, without which the dead are simply gone. That event was first witnessed by women, the same women who had been funding the movement from the beginning in Galilee, the same women whose contribution to that movement was rendered in the domestic translation of a word that men got as a title and an office. The witnesses of the foundational event became the apostle, who was erased for 700 years by a name invented in the 13th century. The treasurer became a footnote. The footnote was the first witness. The first witness was called deaconess. Her apostolic standing was rewritten as masculine for 700 years. And then, in 1994, a committee of Greek scholars looked at the evidence and quietly restored a name. Junior, a woman, outstanding among the apostles. It had been true since Paul wrote it in the 1st century. It had been known in the scholarship for generations. It took until the last decade of the 20th century for the correction to make it into the standard critical text that every major Bible translation depends on. Go back to that church, the one you walked into at the beginning. Count the windows again. Peter, James, John, Matthew. The 12 men whose names are carved into every cathedral on the continent. Find Joanna's window. Find Susanna's feast day. Find the chapel dedicated to the many others who funded the movement before the institution existed. They are not there. 3 sentences. That is what they received. And in those 3 sentences, 3 names, 1 husband's name, 1 husband's employer, and the fact that they paid. The church kept the theology. It built the windows and the feast days and the feast day calendars around 12 men. It gave the funders a domestic translation. It invented a masculine form for the apostle. It forgot to carve a single commemorative window for the woman who may have booked the upper room. I am still not sure how to hold all of this at once, because it is not a conspiracy. Nobody gathered in a room and decided to erase Joanna. The erasure happened the way most institutional erasures happen, through accumulated choices, small translation decisions, the domestic word instead of the official word, the masculine correction instead of the female original, the omission that looks like oversight but appears consistently enough across centuries, across translation teams, across theological traditions that disagree on almost everything else. Consistently enough that Schüssler Fiorenza spent a book documenting the pattern. The record was always there. Luke 8, 1-3. The Diakonein double standard. Joanna at the tomb. Junior, outstanding among the apostles. All of it in the text. All of it in the scholarship. All of it visible, accessible, documented. The editing just disagreed. You decide what to do with this.